I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's a polite way of saying I had turned into a man who could rebuild a transmission blindfolded and still couldn't answer a text from his own daughter. I was 52, worked the county line garage 6 days most weeks, and I trusted numbers that came with units attached. Foot-pounds, millimeters, PSI. If a spec said 48, you set 48 and moved on. Feelings didn't come with a torque wrench setting, so after my wife, Marcy, died 3 years earlier, I handled grief the same way I handled rusted bolts. Force, heat, silence. I kept the trailer clean enough, paid my bills on time, and ate standing up over the sink so I could call it a meal and be done with it. Folks around Mill Creek said I was holding together. What they meant was I still showed up to work. Most mornings started in the dark with burnt coffee and weather radio low on the counter. By late October, every forecast ended with the same line about an early hard front they were calling the November freeze. Like naming it made it less mean. Overnight lows dropping fast. Lake roads icing early. Black ice on shaded stretches. I listened, nodded to nobody, and grabbed my keys. The garage heater coughed to life around 6:30, and by 7 I was under somebody's pickup, shoulder against cold concrete, pretending the smell of brake cleaner was enough to keep my head straight. It helped some days. Not because work healed anything, but because engines don't ask what you feel when they stall. They ask what failed. That's a framework I understood. By the first week of November, my hands had started cramping at odd times. I'd be lining up a socket and my fingers would lock like I'd grabbed live wire. I blamed cold weather, then cheap gloves, then not enough water. Then one Tuesday, I stood up too fast from a creeper and the shop floor came at me sideways. I caught myself on a tool cart and told my apprentice I'd skipped breakfast. He believed me because I said it like a man who believed himself. 2 days later, I was back under a county plow truck and got hit with a wave of nausea so hard I had to sit right there in slush and grit until it passed. I still finished the job. That's the kind of stubbornness people clap for, right up until a doctor calls it denial. The clinic sat between a pharmacy and a tax office in a low brick strip that smelled like copier paper and hand sanitizer. I almost walked out twice before they called my name. Dr. Singh had kind eyes and a careful way of talking that made bad news feel structured, which I appreciated and hated at the same time. He set my lab results on the desk between us and rotated the pages so I could see the columns. Creatinine, EGFR, potassium. Numbers sliding the wrong direction in a hurry. He explained kidney function in plain language, drew a simple diagram on a notepad, and didn't sugarcoat where I was. "We need to move fast, Russell," he said. "Your kidneys are failing faster than we'd expect. Not tomorrow, but not 6 months from now either. We're talking dialysis planning now, not later." I stared at the paper like I could bargain with it. Planning as in diet and pills? Planning as in orientation, access consult, and support. You'll still have life. Work may still be possible with adjustments, but the schedule will reorder things. I heard the sentence and still tried to step around it. I can't miss that much time. County contract trucks come in heavy once real winter starts. He folded his hands and gave me a look I can still see when I close my eyes. Not pity, just steady truth. You need someone with you through this. Logistics, appointments, recovery days. I know that's personal, but it matters medically too. I gave a short laugh that didn't sound right in my own ears. Someone with me. That's the expensive option. His expression stayed kind, but he didn't let me hide. "Who's your emergency contact now?" I looked out his office window at a dead planter box and said, "My daughter, Lena." "Good, call her today." That was the hardest sentence in that room, and it didn't come from the lab sheet. Call her today. I had Lena listed on forms because it looked responsible. In real life, I'd spent 3 years replying late, cancelling dinners, and pretending busy at the shop was a complete relationship. The last time we spoke for more than 5 minutes was at Christmas, when she asked why I never visited unless there was a broken furnace or flat tire involved. I told her I didn't drive well at night. She said, "Dad, it's not night every day." Then we talked about weather for 30 seconds and hung up. A primary consideration in my life had become avoiding the places where love required an answer from me. I left the clinic with a folder full of appointment cards and a packet labelled Renal Education in cheerful blue letters. In the parking lot, I sat in my truck with the engine off and read the first page 3 times without understanding a word. Around me, people came and went, holding coffee cups, tote bags, normal errands. My phone was in my hand for 10 minutes while I stared at Lena's name. Thumb hovered, pulled back, hovered again. I typed, deleted, typed, deleted. The resulting tension was almost funny in a miserable way. I could unbolt C's suspension on a 2011 Silverado, but need to talk made my chest tighten like a vice. I finally sent, got some health news. Not emergency. Could we talk later? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, at work, you okay? I wrote, yeah, just tired. I'll call tonight. Her answer came quick. Okay. That one word weighed more than the whole packet on the passenger seat. It had room in it for caution, fatigue, maybe old hurt. It also had room for a door still cracked open, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I did what I had been doing for 3 years. I turned the key, drove past my own turnoff, and pointed the truck toward the reservoir road like a man following a habit he could call practical. Marcy's memorial bench sat on the west side of the old reservoir outside Mill Creek, 1/2 mile from the closed bait shack, facing cattails and open water that turned steel grey whenever clouds packed in. Her sister and I had installed that bench the spring after the funeral. Cedar slats, cast iron arms, small brass plaque. Marcy Preston, who loved this quiet shore. I hadn't been there in months, maybe a year. Grief has its own map, and sometimes you avoid the places marked home because they cost too much to stand in. The afternoon had that iron-grey look that makes colours go thin. No wind. No ripple except what the loon made gliding out near the reeds, black head low, cutting a clean line through still water without calling once. Even the usual chatter from the tree line felt muted, as if every jay and squirrel had signed a truce. I sat and listened to my own breathing until it slowed from clinic pace to something closer to human. My hands smelled faintly like diesel and orange hand soap. The bench was damp through my jeans. I stayed anyway. I talked out loud because there was nobody there to hear me, and because silence can push truth out of a man if he sits in it long enough. I got news, Mars, I said, and my voice cracked on her name like old wood. Bad one. I rubbed my palms on my thighs and laughed once. Quiet. Dialysis, that's the word. They said it like I should already know where to park and what forms to sign. I stared at the lake. You'd have asked better questions. You always ask the right ones. A long minute passed. Maybe 2. The loon dipped and came up farther out, silver drops sliding off its neck. I said, I'm scared. Those 2 words sat in the air and didn't kill me, which surprised me more than the diagnosis. I'd been carrying fear like contraband, tucked where nobody could find it, including me. Fear of being sick, fear of being weak, fear of turning into a burden. Underneath all of it, the deeper one, that I'd die before I learned how to be Lena's father again instead of the man who mailed checks and gave weather updates. I took out my phone and called her before I could talk myself out of it. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Hey, she said, careful but not cold. I could hear office noise behind her. You said you'd call. Yeah, I did. My throat felt dry. You got a minute? I can step outside. Hold on. I heard a door open, then close. Wind brushed her speaker for a second. Okay, I'm here. What's going on? I watched the far shore where bare cottonwoods stood like dark brushstrokes against cloud. I had blood work done. More than once, they found kidney trouble. I swallowed. Not little trouble. There was a pause, then her voice got very steady, the way people do when they're scared and trying not to show it. How bad? Bad enough they're scheduling dialysis orientation. Another pause. I heard her exhale. When did you find out? Today. Why am I hearing this after work hours, Dad? Because I'm a coward would have been accurate. So would because I got used to being alone and mistook it for strength. I went with the plain version. I didn't know how to say it. She stayed quiet, and the quiet wasn't punishment. It was space for honesty. Maybe the first real space we'd had in years. Then she said, Are you at the lake? I looked down at the bench slat, at rain-dark cedar, and one wet yellow leaf stuck flat against it. Yeah. You only go there when you're really hurting. That one landed clean. Yeah. Her voice softened, and I heard my little girl under the grown woman. I can come by tonight after I get off if you want. Not long, just to talk. The part of me that had been shut tight since Marcy died wanted to say no out of habit. Don't bother, I'm fine. Handle your life. Instead, I looked over that still water and felt the shape of a different answer, awkward and overdue. I'd like that, I said. I'd really like that. Okay, text me when you're home so I know where to go. I will. We hung up, and I sat there with the phone in my lap while daylight thinned toward evening. Across the reservoir, a pair of geese crossed low and quiet, wings beating slow. The woods behind me stayed hushed, not empty exactly, just watchful in a way I didn't have words for yet. By the time dusk began to gather over the cattails, I was still on that bench, cold through my jacket, breathing easier than I had all week, and for once, I didn't hurry away from what hurt. I stayed put until the grey light flattened into that thin blue hour when shoreline and sky start borrowing colour from each other, and the cold came up through the bench slats like it had an old grudge. The plaque under Marcy's name held a bead of water along the edge, bright as solder, and I rubbed it away with my thumb without thinking. Out on the reservoir, the loon drifted farther from shore, a dark comma against still water, and never made a sound. No wind through the cottonwoods, no slap of little waves against rock. Even the reeds stood still, stiff and straight, as if the whole place had drawn a breath and forgotten to let it out. I had worked around enough engines to respect quiet when it showed up all at once. Usually it meant something was about to fail or something had already gone wrong. I leaned forward with my elbows on my knees and tried to picture what dialysis would look like in real terms, not brochure language. Clock times, needles, days rearranged around a machine I had never seen up close. Dr. Singh had said I might still work with adjustments, but that word carried a lot of weight when your paycheck depended on crawling under frozen axles before sunrise. I started doing the math the way I always did when I got cornered. If I lost 2 mornings a week at the shop, if winter call-outs ran late, if fatigue hit hard, if bills stayed where they were. The arithmetic got ugly fast. Then Lena's face slid into that mental spreadsheet and made it worse, because numbers couldn't account for 3 years of half answers and missed Sundays. I had been telling myself I was giving her space to build her life. Truth was, I didn't know how to stand in mine without Marcy there to translate me. The cold settled deeper, and I pulled my jacket up at the collar. Somewhere behind me, a branch gave a small, dry creak. Then, nothing again. I spoke low, mostly to keep from folding in on myself. You'd be annoyed with me, Mars. Not mean, just that look. I tried to imitate her, one eyebrow up like I'd forgotten to tighten lug nuts. Russell Preston, you don't get to disappear and call it coping. My laugh came out thin and fogged in front of me. You hear me doing your voice from a wet bench, that's probably your sign I'm not handling this with dignity. It was a weak joke, but it kept me from freezing up inside. Gentle humour was all I had left when plain facts got too sharp. I told myself I could leave in 5 minutes. I told myself I needed to get home, warm up, and clean the trailer before Lena came over. I told myself I should practice saying the medical stuff out loud so I wouldn't stumble around it like I had on the phone. Instead, I stayed and listened to my own thoughts ricochet. I'm sick. I'm scared. I waited too long to call my daughter. I'm still here. That last line surprised me. Not inspired, not fixed, just present. I watched my hands, rough and cracked at the knuckles from degreaser and cold, resting open on my thighs. For years, those hands had been good at solving the wrong kind of problems. Tighten this, replace that. Patch and move on. They had not been good at reaching. A little after full dusk, one amber light came on across the water at a lakeside house tucked behind pines. Then another, farther down the ridge. Human signs, steady and ordinary. I pulled out my phone and typed to Lena. Leaving the lake now. I'll be home in 20. Take your time after work. She answered while I was still looking at the screen. On my way in about an hour. Want me to bring soup? I stared at that for a beat longer than necessary. Bring yourself, I wrote. Soup if you want. Her reply was a small red heart. No words. Just that. My throat tightened again, but this time it felt less like panic and more like relief I had not earned yet. I set the phone beside me and sat back, meaning to stand right then. That was when I noticed the shape on the bench, slat to my right, about a foot from my hip, where there had only been rain-dark cedar a moment earlier. It was a stone, maybe 2 inches across, smooth as worn glass, pale grey with a darker seam running through the centre, and it was shaped so plainly like a heart that my first reaction was annoyance at my own eyes. I picked it up and turned it toward the last of the light. Not carved, no tool marks, river polished all over. I pressed it to my palm and frowned because it felt warmer than the bench, warmer than the air, like it had been in someone's pocket. I looked down at the mud by my boots, then behind the bench, then out toward the empty trail. Well, I said to nobody, either geology just turned sentimental or I finally broke something upstairs. The line hung there, and I shook my head at myself. I had said stranger things to inanimate objects in my life, but this was a new category. I set the stone in my left hand and ran my right over the bench slat, as if another one might appear if I checked the grain. Nothing. Just damp cedar and a stuck leaf curled at the edges. A soft rustle came from the reeds downshore, not quick, not sneaking. Just patient movement through dry stalks. I stood halfway, then stopped, when an old farm dog stepped out onto the path like he belonged there. I had seen him around Mill Creek near the feed store and once behind the post office, mottled tan and white with a broad chest gone a little narrow from age, one ear tipped over and the other straight up. He carried himself easy, tail low and loose, no collar, no hurry. He glanced at me, then at the stone in my hand, and walked over until his nose was inches from my knuckles. One long sniff. No flinch, no whine. Then he sat down against my boots with a grunt that said his joints had opinions, and fixed his gaze on the cedar tree line across the narrow strip of shore. I followed his eyes. The trees were dark bars against darker dark, trunks close set, understory mostly shadow. Nothing moving that I could pick out. No deer flash, No owl lift. Just that same deep quiet laid across the place, broad and settled. The dog's ears twitched once, then settled forward again. He was not tense. That mattered. Any shop dog I'd ever known could read trouble faster than people did, and this one looked like he'd found a familiar porch to guard while his people finished chores. "You know something I don't?" I asked him. His tail tapped my boot twice, slow and content, then stilled. He kept watching the trees with that calm, unblinking interest, like he expected someone polite to step out eventually, and had no concern about it either way. I crouched and scratched the side of his neck. His fur was thick with burrs and dry reed bits, and he leaned into my hand hard enough to shift my balance. Up close he smelled like wet hay, old wood smoke, and clean mud. I had half a jerky stick in my jacket pocket from lunch, and offered it. He took it gentle, lips careful around my fingers, chewed twice, and set his chin on my knee as if we'd known each other a long time. For a minute or maybe 10 we sat like that, two tired creatures at the edge of cold water, while night settled in, both looking at trees for reasons we couldn't explain. A faint scent drifted across the shore then, earthy and clean, like turned leaves after rain with a deeper animal note under it. Not rank and not sharp. The dog lifted his head, sniffed once, and relaxed even more, which felt backward to every caution light in my body. I listened for footfalls and heard only a distant drip from the dock pilings and the tiny tick of cooling metal from my truck where it sat up the path. The stillness wasn't empty. It was attentive, the way a good mechanic stands silent for a second after starting an engine. Not anxious, just listening for what's true. I slipped the stone into my shirt pocket and buttoned the flap over it, sudden and protective, like I was storing a small part I couldn't replace. "All right," I told the dog, pushing up to stand. "I'm heading out. You coming?" He rose, stretched long through his back legs, and fell in beside me without being asked again. We walked the narrow trail to the parking pull-off, our steps crunching on thin grit and frosted leaves. At the truck he paused and looked back once toward the bench, tail giving a slow sweep, then hopped up into the passenger seat, as if that decision had been made earlier by someone with better judgment than mine. I laughed under my breath while I turned the key. "You trust strangers too easy," I said, then realized I was talking to myself as much as him. The heater kicked on, rattling before it found rhythm, and we rolled out along the reservoir road at 25, careful on the first slick spots where shade held the cold. In the rearview mirror, the shoreline disappeared into cedar dark. No drama to it, just distance. My hand kept drifting to the shirt pocket where the stone rested against my chest, warm at first, then gradually cooling to match me. And by the time the first town lights of Mill Creek showed through the windshield, I'd stopped trying to explain where it came from and started paying attention to what it had asked of me. Stay, notice, and don't shut the door this time. By the time I turned onto my road, the dog had curled one paw over the edge of the seat and gone half asleep, head bobbing with each rut, like he had ridden in that truck for years. My trailer sat where it always sat, plain and square under a weak porch light. But I parked and waited with the engine idling because I could feel two separate weights in me and didn't know which one to pick up first. Kidney failure on one side, a warm stone shaped like a heart on the other. One came with lab values and appointment cards. The other came with no explanation at all. The dog solved it for me by opening his eyes, giving a quiet huff, and looking toward the house like we had work to do. "All right," I said, shutting the truck off. "You can supervise." He jumped down stiffly, trotted to the porch, and sat at the top step before I even got my key in the lock. Inside smelled like cold drywall and machine oil and the coffee grounds I'd forgotten to throw out that morning. I clicked on the kitchen light, pulled the stone from my pocket, and set it on the counter beside the sink. Under bright light, it looked even stranger in its ordinariness. River smooth, pale, exactly heart-shaped without being ornamental. I held my palm over it again. No heat now, just stone. I fed the dog a scoop of dry food from an old bag I kept for strays that passed through, and he ate polite, not frantic, then wandered to the living room and lay down near Marcy's chair like he had been invited there by name. Lena knocked 40 minutes later, 2 quick raps and 1 softer one, the same pattern she used as a teenager when she came home after curfew and hoped I was asleep. I opened the door before she could knock again. She stood bundled in a dark coat, hair pulled back, soup container in one hand and that steady, guarded expression in the other. "Hey," she said. "Hey, kiddo." I stepped aside. "Come in. It's warmer than it feels out there." She walked in, stopped when she saw the dog, and raised her eyebrows. "Since when do you have a dog?" "Since about an hour ago, apparently. He hired himself." That got a short laugh out of her, small but real. She crouched, let the dog sniff her fingers, then scratched under his chin. "Well, he's got taste. He picked the grumpiest mechanic in 2 counties. I'm top 3, easy." She set the soup on the counter and turned toward me. The humour dropped away and the room felt close. "Tell me what the doctor said, not the edited version." So I told her. I told her about Dr. Singh, the numbers, the word fast, the orientation packet, the way "you need someone with you" hit harder than anything else in that office. I told her I was embarrassed, scared, and mad at my own body in no useful order. I left out nothing that mattered. The dog stayed on the rug between us, head on paws, listening like this was his house meeting. Lena leaned against the counter and folded her arms tight, then unfolded them, then did it again. "I'm angry," she said, voice controlled but shaking at the edges. "Not about you being sick, about how you always call when it's already serious. Like I'm a last resort and not your daughter." "I know. I needed you after Mom died too, Dad. You disappeared while standing 10 feet away from me." Those words were clean and deserved. I took them and didn't defend myself. "You're right, I did." She looked at me a long time, reading for excuses. When she didn't find one, her shoulders lowered a little. "What happens next?" "Orientation Thursday, more labs before that. They'll talk schedule, access, all the parts I don't understand yet. Then I go with you. You work full-time." "So do you. We'll figure it out." The resulting tension in my chest eased a notch, not because the problem shrank, but because it wasn't mine alone for the first time. She glanced down and noticed the stone by the sink. "What's that?" I picked it up and handed it over. "Found it on Marcy's bench at dusk. Didn't see anybody near me. It was just there." She rolled it in her fingers, eyes narrowing the way mine do when something mechanical doesn't add up. "It's pretty." "Yeah. Could have been a kid left it, or somebody from town." "Could have." She gave me a look that said she heard the gap between my answer and my belief. "You sound like you're not convinced." I leaned one hip against the counter and let out a breath. "I don't know what I am. I'm tired. Maybe I missed something obvious." I nodded toward the dog. "He came out of the reeds right after. Sniffed it, sat by my boots, stared into the trees like he was waiting on a friend." Lena glanced toward the living room. "He seems calm." "Too calm, maybe." "Dad, if this is your midlife ghost phase, I need warning so I can pace myself." That one got me. I laughed harder than I expected, enough that my eyes watered for reasons that weren't all funny. "Fair. I'll issue a bulletin." We ate soup at the small table, knees bumping under chipped laminate, talking practical details because practical details are how our family says love when bigger words feel exposed. She put the orientation date in her phone. I wrote down 2 backup contacts she insisted on. She made me promise to answer when she called, not 3 hours later, not next morning. Outside, the first edge of the November freeze started to show itself in the sound of sleet tapping lightly against the aluminum skirting. When she left, she hugged me at the door and held on a second longer than usual. "Text me when you wake up," she said. "Not because you need permission, because I need to know you're up." "I can do that." After her tail lights disappeared, I stood under the porch light until the cold bit through my shirt. The dog pressed against my leg and looked toward the dark line of cottonwoods behind the trailer lot, ears forward, tail still. Not alarmed, attentive. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but black branches and a strip of sky turning hard with weather. Even so, I had the odd feeling we were not alone in the night, and that it was not a bad thing. I slept in pieces and gave up before dawn. At 4:30, I texted Lena, "Up, coffee on." Dog still employed. She answered with a thumbs up and a coffee cup. By 5, I was back in the truck with the dog beside me and the stone heart in my jacket pocket, heading toward the reservoir through a thin glaze of road ice that made the steering feel light and serious all at once. The shoreline was all silver blue when we got there, frost in the grass and a low skin of mist hugging the reeds. The bench waited under a crust of rime, Marcy's plaque dulled white. I brushed it clean with my glove, sat down, and let the quiet settle. My grief was still there, same weight, same edges, but curiosity moved in beside it and asked for room. I found myself scanning details instead of sinking. Tracks near the mudline, broken cattail stems, the pattern of frost where something had passed. About 20 feet from the bench, on a flat patch of ground that caught first light, 2 stones sat crossed over each other like careful hands. They were different colours, one dark, one pale, both too clean to have landed that way by chance after a windy night. I walked over and crouched. No scuff marks around them except light frost disturbance, no boot tread, no paw prints I recognised. The dog came up behind me, sniffed once, and sat down again, facing the tree line with that same patient posture. I told myself, this couldn't be real in the way it looked. Kids messing around, fisherman habit. My own pattern-hungry brain trying to make meaning because I was scared and sleep-starved. Evidence suggests people see what they need when life corners them. That framework had carried me through plenty of rough seasons. The problem was, each explanation slid off this moment like a dull wrench on a rounded bolt. Nobody else was there. Frost held clean where footprints should have been. And the dog, who had no use for stories, looked into the cedars like he recognized decency before I did. By the second week of November, I had started arriving at that bench before every shift, mostly because 10 minutes there steadied my breathing better than any lecture I gave myself. Some mornings I found nothing new and felt almost disappointed, which told me more than I liked about where my head had gone. Other mornings there were small courtesies laid out with care. A fan of late asters, stems trimmed and arranged at the spot Lena used to claim when she came with us as a teenager. Split birch stacked under the bench after a freezing rain, dry enough to catch with one match. One more smooth heartstone set near the plaque, always where I could not miss it, and always where no fresh tracks led in. I did not tell anybody at work. I clocked in, changed oil, replaced tie rods, argued with a supplier about wrong brake rotors, and kept my mouth shut. At lunch, I'd reach into my pocket and touch whichever stone I had brought that day, like checking for a pulse. At home, I lined them on the windowsill above the sink and told myself I was keeping them as a weather oddity. The lie got thinner every day. 3 mornings later, fog rolled in heavy enough to blur shore from water, and the reservoir looked like it had no far side. The dog and I took the narrow path past the bench toward the old boat ramp because I had heard a faint splashing down there, steady and irritated, not panicked. We moved slow on slick boards and wet leaves. The sound came again, then a wing beat, then silence. I saw the mallard first, half hidden near the reeds, one leg tangled in a long loop of discarded fishing line, caught on a submerged branch. He'd flap, twist, settle and pull tighter each time. I stepped down the bank, boots sliding in mud, and the dog stayed at the top, watching over my shoulder. That was when I heard weight moving through cedars behind me. Not crashing, not the random racket of a deer bolting. This was measured, branch by branch, as if whatever made it knew exactly what noise it was making and chose the smallest amount. I straightened and turned. At first, all I had was shape inside fog, dark and vertical where no trunk stood, then a shoulder broad enough to block the pale light behind it. He stepped clear of 2 cedars and stopped at what I judged to be 30 yards, maybe a little more. 8 feet, maybe more than that. Dark fur slicked with mist, chest deep and solid, arms long with hands that looked large enough to palm a hubcap. His face was partly shadowed, but I caught the eyes, amber brown and steady on me. Not hard, not challenging, just present. My body locked from habit. Every warning system I owned lit up, then stalled because the posture in front of me did not match danger. He did not square up, did not advance. He angled his body slightly away, lowered his head once, and waited. I wanted to run and wanted to stay in the same breath. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. The knowing came before logic and sat deeper than fear. Behind me the mallard thrashed again, lines snapping against reeds. I glanced back toward the bird, then toward the figure, and when I looked again, he had moved. One slow step, then another, circling wide so he never closed distance on me. He reached the waterline, crouched with astonishing control for something that large, and slipped one hand beneath the branch where the fishing line had cinched. His fingers were thick and dark, knuckles furred, movements precise as a watchmaker. He lifted the branch just enough to release tension, pinched the loop, and drew it free from the duck's leg in one clean motion. The mallard kicked loose, hesitated a beat as if stunned by luck, then paddled hard into open water and vanished into fog. He held the wet line for a second, looked toward me again, then laid it on a rock above the water, where it could not catch anything else. Deliberate. Finished. Then he backed away the same way he came, each step careful, head slightly lowered, giving me space as if that mattered to him. The dog at the top of the bank wagged once, slow, and relaxed. I stood in mud with my breath loud in my ears, and watched that broad, dark shape pass between the cedars until fog swallowed him. No snapped branches, no drama, just absence returning by degrees. When I could move, I climbed back to the path and sat on the bench because my knees said that was non-negotiable. The dog put his chin on my thigh and looked up at me like he had been waiting for me to catch up to what he already knew. My hands shook, not from cold alone. I laughed once, quiet and unbelieving, then covered my face and breathed until the shaking eased. Out on the reservoir, the loon called for the first time all week, one low note rolling across the water like a door opening. The loon's call rolled out over the water and faded into the fog, and I sat there with my hands on my knees and felt my whole practical life trying to reassemble itself around what I had just seen. I had watched a creature bigger than any man I knew free a trapped duck with the kind of care most people don't use when they untangle extension cords. I had watched him choose distance, choose patience, choose not to crowd me. Nothing in that fit the stories people tell when they're trying to sound tough over coffee. The old dog leaned harder into my leg and sighed, like my delayed understanding was not his problem. I made myself stand and walk back down the bank, mostly because standing still felt harder. The fishing line lay where he had set it, looped neatly on a flat rock above the waterline. Not thrown, not snapped and left. Set where it couldn't catch another leg. I picked it up and coiled it tighter, then stuffed it in my jacket pocket. My fingers were clumsy and cold, but I kept working because doing something with my hands was the only way I knew to slow my pulse. In the mud near the cedar edge, I found 2 prints pressed deep enough to hold a skim of water, longer than my forearm from wrist to elbow, heel and toe shape, clear as a cast. I put my boot beside one and felt a laugh rise in my chest, for no reason except shock. My size 13 looked like a kid's shoe left by mistake. The dog padded down beside me, sniffed the edge of the print, then sat and looked into the trees with an expression I had seen on old men at church funerals, solemn but not afraid. I crouched there and let my eyes move over every detail I could trust. The direction of stride, the lack of churned ground, the way branches at shoulder height had bent and sprung back clean instead of tearing. Whatever he was, he moved like he respected the place. I touched the muddy edge with one finger, then wiped it on my jeans and stood up slow, like any quick motion might break the spell and drop me back into a world where this morning had not happened. On the walk back to the bench, I ran my usual explanation cycle and heard how thin it sounded. Bear didn't work, not with those hands and that posture. Prank didn't work, not out here in freezing fog with prints that deep and that stride length. Exhaustion didn't work because the dog saw him too and never gave one alarm bark. I still wanted a tidy answer that could sit on a work order line and be done with it. Instead, I had mud in my pocket, fishing line in my jacket, and a new understanding that whatever watched this shoreline wasn't hunting trouble. It was doing the opposite. I sat again, and the dog rested his chin on my boot. "All right," I said quietly toward the cedars, toward whoever might still be in there. "Thank you." The words felt awkward and plain, but they settled right. No response came besides a faint drip from the pines and the soft lap of water against rock. That was enough. I took one of the earlier heartstones from my coat pocket and set it on the bench slat beside Marcy's plaque, then changed my mind and held it again. I wasn't ready to leave any of them behind yet. At the shop, I was 10 minutes late, which got me a raised eyebrow from Calvin at the front bay and nothing else. We were buried in winter prep work, county ploughs, and salted out brake lines, and normally that kind of pace erased everything outside the garage door. That day, it didn't. I overtalked a caliper bolt, caught myself, backed it off, and stood there staring at the wrench until my apprentice asked if I was feeling all right. "Just stiff," I told him. Cold got in my hands. He nodded, accepted it, and went back to bleeding lines. I worked through the shift on muscle memory, but every quiet moment my mind returned to that shoreline and those amber-brown eyes that had met mine without challenge. Just presence. Around lunch, I pulled the coiled fishing line from my jacket and dropped it in the shop trash, then pulled it out again and put it in the scrap bin instead, like part of me wanted to keep proof, and part of me wanted to stop handling it. I settled on wrapping it around a broken marker pen and locking it in my toolbox drawer. Evidence of something, even if I couldn't label what. By late afternoon, the November freeze started earning its name. Sleet rattled the bay doors, and a glaze formed on every untreated surface faster than the salt trucks could keep up. I texted Lena from the parts counter. "Roads turning bad." "I'm good. You still okay for Thursday?" she answered in under a minute. "I'm going with you. No debate. Eat dinner." Her certainty steadied me more than coffee ever had. I typed, "Yes, ma'am," and she sent back one eye-roll emoji and a red heart. That evening, with sleet ticking against the trailer roof and the old dog asleep by Marcy's chair, I dug through a kitchen drawer until I found the cracked black thermos cap Marcy used to call my lucky coin. It had lived in that drawer for years, useless and somehow unthrowable, because it was the one piece that survived a camp stove spill on a trout trip we took before Lena was born. Marcy had laughed herself breathless when I tried to screw it back on anyway. I turned the cap in my hand while the lights flickered once, then twice, and a thought settled in with a clarity I didn't argue with. If what I had seen was real, and if kindness was the language being offered, I could answer in that language. I drove back to the reservoir in the dark, slow on the ice patches, and carried the thermos cap to the bench with a flashlight in one hand. The sleet came thin and sharp, stinging the backs of my fingers. I set the cap on the right side of the bench, where Lena used to swing her legs and complain about mosquitoes every summer, and placed one heartstone beside it. The dog stood close to my knee, calm as ever, watching the tree line and then looking up at me like he approved of the plan. "This matters to me," I said into the cold. "That cap and that spot. I don't know what you are, but if you understand any of this, there it is." I felt foolish while I said it, and peaceful at the same time. No movement answered, no dramatic sign. Just sleet, dark water, and the sound of my own breathing. I headed home with empty hands and slept deeper than I had in weeks. 2 mornings later, the storm had hardened into mean cold that turned the access road into a dull black ribbon of hazard, and I crept down to the lake in first gear with the dog braced against the seat. Dawn came grudging and blue through a low cloud deck. The bench looked rimed in sugar from frozen mist, and for 1 second I thought the spot was empty and my chest dropped. Then I stepped closer. The thermos cap sat dead center on Marcy's side of the bench, clean and dry despite the weather, set upright like it had been placed by deliberate fingers. Next to it rested a new stone heart, darker than the others, with a pale stripe running clean through the middle. Under the bench, tucked behind the cast-iron leg where sleet hadn't reached, was a bundle of split cedar kindling wrapped in broad bark and tied with thin reed stems, all of it dry enough to light. I knelt and touched the wood. Crisp, light, prepared for use, not display. I looked around for tracks and found them in the thin snow dust along the path. Deep impressions leading in from the cedar stand and back out the same way, with no sign of hurry. The old dog wagged once and sat beside the bundle, then nosed it toward me. The whole arrangement was so practical it almost undid me. Not a performance, not a mystery for mystery's sake. It was help, aimed straight at the places I was fraying. Marcy's memory, Lena's seat on that bench, the cold I kept pretending I could outwork. I carried the bundle to the old fire ring near the closed bait shack, built a small morning fire and watched it catch on the first match. The cedar gave off that clean resin smell, bright and steady, and heat pushed back the freeze enough to sting my cheeks. I set the new stone on my knee and held the thermos cap in my palm until both felt like parts of the same story. The dog stretched out by the fire and closed his eyes, content as a paid employee on break. Movement at the edge of the trees drew my eye. He stood there between 2 cedars, maybe 40 yards out this time, shoulders broad against the dim light, hands hanging easy at his sides. He didn't approach the fire. He didn't retreat when I looked directly at him. We stayed like that for a long minute. 2 creatures in the morning cold, learning a boundary that felt like trust. I raised the thermos cap a little, half salute, half thank you. He tilted his head once, then lowered his gaze toward the firewood, as if to make sure I understood the point. Care first. No spectacle. My throat tightened and words came out rough. "You're helping me." Saying it aloud made it truer than any thought I'd had alone in the truck. "I see that." The wind shifted, carrying smoke and lake smell and that same earthy scent I had noticed before. Leaf mold and clean animal musk. He took one slow step back into shadow, then another, and was gone in a way that felt courteous rather than abrupt. I sat by the fire until my hands stopped shaking, then banked it safe and hauled what was left of the cedar bundle to my truck. At the bench, I picked up the returned thermos cap and both stones, then paused and set the newest heart back on Lena's side for a moment, just to see it there. The sight hit me hard, not with grief this time, but with a widening sense that I wasn't being mocked by random chance. I was being met patiently in a language built from objects and distance and attention. When I got home, I lined the thermos cap and 3 heartstones on the windowsill above the sink, where morning light would hit them first. I kept the cedar kindling stacked by the door. At noon, Lena called on her break, and I answered on the first ring. "You sound better," she said after hello. "I am better today," I said, and that was honest. "Road's rough, but I'm upright." "Eat something real, not crackers," she said, "and send me your appointment time again." "I will. And Lena?" "Yeah?" I looked at the stones, then out toward the cottonwoods, then back again. "Thanks for not giving up on me." Her exhale softened through the phone. "I've been mad, Dad. I never gave up." After we hung up, I stood there in my small kitchen with a dog snoring in the other room, sleet ticking at the window, and evidence of quiet kindness lined up in plain sight. The world had not gotten smaller or easier. My kidneys were still failing. Thursday was still coming. The freeze was still locking roads and testing every weak place in me. But the underlying shape of things had shifted. Out by that lake, something vast had looked at me and not turned away. And in the middle of a hard season, it had chosen to care for what I cared for. I carried that with both hands. That evening, I called Lena while the trailer windows clicked with sleet, and I asked if she would meet me at the reservoir instead of coming by the house. I expected hesitation, maybe a practical no, but she said yes right away, then added, "I need to say some things where Mum can hear me too." I sat with that after we hung up, listening to the old dog pace once and settle by the door as if he knew we were heading out. By 7:30, the November freeze had tightened its grip, glazing the road edges and turning every headlight into a blurred halo. I drove slow, both hands on the wheel, stones in my pocket, feeling like I was carrying hardware for a repair I had put off too long. Lena's car was already there when I reached the pull-off, engine running, wipers fighting sleet. She stepped out with her coat zipped to her chin, a knit hat pulled low, and a small blue medical cooler looped over her forearm. I nodded toward it when we met at the bench. "You bringing supplies for me now?" I asked, trying for light. She shook her head. "For Noah. Backup insulin and sensors. Picked him up from aftercare, dropped him with Travis, forgot this in my trunk earlier. I'm not leaving it in the car to freeze." She set it beside the bench leg, careful and automatic, then looked out over the dark water. "I'm glad you asked me here." The lake looked like hammered steel under a thin moon, cattails bent with ice, cedar tops black against a low sky. No wind at first, just sleet, stitching faint lines through the light from the lot. The old dog sat between us, chest against my shin, watching the tree line the way he always did. Lena rubbed her gloves together, then said, "I've been practicing this conversation all day, and now I hate every version of it." I kept my voice low. "Say the one you hate least." She laughed once, brittle. "Fine. I'm furious at you. and I'm terrified for you. Both are true." Her face tightened. "When Mom died, you went quiet and called it being strong. I kept waiting for you to come back." I stared at Marcy's plaque until the letters blurred under sleet. "I know." Lena shook her head. "No. Hear me. I had Noah, a mortgage, a full-time schedule, grief of my own, and I still would have made room for you if you had just shown up as a person. Not a mechanic, not a fixer, a dad." She swallowed hard. "Then this diagnosis drops, and I'm scared I'm going to lose you while we're still strangers in the same family." The sentence cracked in the middle. She sat down hard, put her elbows on her knees, and covered her face with both hands as crying took her in quiet, shaking waves. I sat beside her and did nothing clever. That was new for me. I put one hand between her shoulder blades and left it there while she cried against the sleet and the cold and the years we had both mismanaged. The old dog moved closer and rested his head on her boot. She let out a wet laugh through tears. "Even your random dog is emotionally available." I almost smiled. Then my own chest gave way. "Lena, I have been so ashamed of how I handled losing her that I made not feeling anything my whole personality. I thought I was sparing you my mess. What I did was leave you alone in yours." My voice roughened. "I am scared of dying. I'm scared of being weak in front of you. I'm more scared of wasting whatever time I have left, pretending I'm fine." She lowered her hands and looked at me full on, face wet, eyes red and steady. "Then don't pretend. Not with me." I nodded, and something I had held clamped down since Marcy's funeral finally let go. Tears came without permission and without drama, just steady and hot in weather cold enough to sting. I cried at that bench with my daughter watching, and nobody died of embarrassment. Nobody called it weakness. She leaned into me, and I leaned back, and for a long minute we sat there like survivors of the same storm, admitting we had been on the same side all along. Sleet thickened. Lena wiped her cheeks and sniffed. "Can we sit in your truck for a minute? My fingers are numb." I stood and said, "Yeah, I've got blankets behind the seat." The lot had gone slick while we talked, a clear skin over packed gravel and concrete. I took 3 steps toward the ramp-side path where I'd parked, boot tread searching for purchase. My right foot hit black ice and shot forward. I dropped hard to one knee, shoulder twisting, and the world narrowed to cold and the sharp, instinctive thought, "This is how people break hips in parking lots and pretend it happened doing something heroic." In that split second, my mind went bright and simple. I am on ice. I am 52 and sick and too proud. I am not steady. I hear Lena call my name behind me and I cannot turn cleanly. I feel the slope toward the ramp and I know where that water is, dark and close. I told myself this couldn't be real, that I could muscle back up, that control was one more hard pull away. Then a hand the size of a shovel blade closed over the back of my coat, not yanking, not crushing, just anchoring, and all that panic math stopped at once. He was there at my left shoulder, broad and dark in moonlit sleet. One arm braced behind me like a rail set in concrete. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, long enough to bring me upright and square my boots under me. As soon as I had balance, he released and stepped back, giving room. Lena had rushed forward when I slipped. In doing so, she'd clipped the blue cooler with her knee. It skidded across the glaze toward the ramp edge. Spinning once, handle out. He pivoted, crossed the distance in 3 long, careful strides, and caught it just before it slid down toward the water. He lifted it high, checked the latch with his thumb, then carried it back and set it directly into Lena's reach. Handle turned toward her gloved hand. She froze. One hand over her mouth, not from terror but from awe. So complete, it looked like prayer. Dad, she whispered, tears restarting. Dad, he's... She could not finish. I could. Barely. I know. The old dog stood beside us, wagging slow, eyes soft, like this was exactly the outcome he had expected from all involved. The creature's head turned between us, then toward the bench, then back again. His eyes in that light were amber brown, calm and ancient, and there was no demand in them. Just witness. Just care offered and not forced. I managed a hoarse, "Thank you," and Lena echoed it, voice shaking. She held the cooler against her chest, like a rescued heirloom. "That's Noah's medicine," she said to me, then toward him, though she kept her tone quiet and grounded. "You kept it safe." He stood still long enough for the words to settle, then angled his body away the way he always did when he was about to leave us space. No posture, no display. At that exact moment he took 2 steps to the bench, lowered one massive hand, and placed a final smooth heartstone on the slat beside Marcy's plaque, precise as setting a glass down on a good table. He looked at us once more from about 30 yards out after he backed toward the cedars, moonlight silvering sleet along his shoulders. Then he turned and moved into the trees with that same deliberate quiet we had learned to recognize, branches parting and settling behind him until there was only dark cedar and falling ice. No dramatic sound marked his going. The silence afterward was full, but gentle, like a room after someone kind has stepped out and left the lamp on. Lena and I stayed where we were, breathing hard, crying off and on, neither of us trying to explain what had just happened into smaller terms. When we finally walked back to the bench, we found the new heartstone glistening with melt, darker than granite, shaped with a rounded left side and a narrow point, natural and unmistakable. Below the bench and along the cedar edge, deep prints pressed into the thin snow crust, each one clean-sided and filling slowly with white. Lena knelt and held her hand above one without touching. "People will say we saw things," she said quietly. "Maybe," I answered, "but we saw this together." She nodded, picked up the stone with both hands and placed it in my palm. "Then we carry it together too." She nodded, picked up the stone with both hands and placed it in my palm. "Then we carry it together too." We stood there until sleet thinned to a soft hiss, and the cold started biting through our jeans. Lena took out her phone and asked, "Can I?" I knew what she meant. I nodded. She photographed the prints along the cedar edge, then held my truck key beside one for scale, practical as a nurse logging vitals. I took pictures too, not to prove anything to strangers, just so I wouldn't let my own doubts sand down the memory later. The old dog moved between us and the bench, calm and steady, and when we turned toward the lot, he walked at Lena's knee, like he had chosen his person for the night. At my trailer, she set the blue cooler on the counter and checked the insulin pens by touch, then by label, then again because fear makes you thorough. "Still cold enough," she said, exhaling. "He kept it from sliding into that runoff." I poured coffee we didn't need and laid out every item on the table under the yellow kitchen light. The first warm heartstone from dusk, the striped one returned with the thermos cap, the darker one from the fire morning, the final stone from Marcy's bench, and the cracked black cap itself. Lena touched each one with 2 fingers, like she was reading a language she had just learned. "These aren't random," she said. "Not after tonight." "Nothing about it felt random," I said. She looked at me for a long second, then gave me that loaded, searching look she used to give when she was 16 and deciding whether I was telling the whole truth. "Do you want to report this? Wildlife office, sheriff? Somebody?" The crux sat right there. Proof versus protection. Being believed versus keeping something gentle from becoming a spectacle. I'll report the fishing line hazard and the bad ice by the ramp, I said. Those are real public safety things. The rest stays with us. She nodded once. Good. People would crowd that shoreline by noon. By 9 the next morning, sunlight broke through in hard, clean bands, and the freeze that had locked everything down for days started to loosen at the edges. Meltwater ticked from the trailer roof. Sand trucks groaned along the main road. The county alert line finally switched from avoid travel to use caution, which in Mill Creek counts as celebration. Lena met me at the reservoir with 2 shovels, a bag of salt, and Noah in the back seat bundled like a small astronaut. He stayed in the warm car with cartoons while we worked the bench path, chopping crusted sleet, scraping black ice, widening the walk from the lot to the plaque until boots could pass safely side by side. Halfway through, Lena leaned on her shovel and smiled without looking at me. Mom would roast your technique. Your mother thought all shovel work required choreography. She wasn't wrong, we laughed, breath fogging in the bright cold. It wasn't dramatic, it was better than dramatic. It was ordinary work done together in a place where we had nearly lost each other. When we finished, we sat on the bench with gloved hands wrapped around gas station coffee and watched Noah press his boots into the slush by the cattails while I held his hood so he wouldn't tip forward. The old dog stood close, supervising like foreman of the shoreline. No new stones appeared that morning. No movement in the cedars besides wind. The quiet felt settled, not empty like a room after a hard conversation that finally told the truth. Thursday came clear and brittle. Lena met me at Dr. Singh's clinic before sunrise, carrying a folder color-coded in a way that made my mechanic heart respect her immediately. In the consult room, Dr. Singh reviewed access options, treatment schedules, diet limits, fatigue patterns, and emergency signs. He asked if my support plan was in place. Lena answered before I could deflect. I'm primary contact, she said. I'll handle transport on treatment days. He'll text me mornings and evenings. If he doesn't answer, I call the shop. Dr. Singh looked at me over his glasses, that same steady gaze from the first visit. That's a strong plan, Russell. It's the first honest one I've had in a while, I said. At the end, he paused with his pen above the chart. You seem different today, less braced. I thought about cedar shadows, a hand on my coat, and a cooler turned handle first toward my daughter. I had some help, I said. He held my eyes a beat, then nodded like a man who knew better than to pry into what he hadn't earned. Take the help. After the appointment, I made the 2 calls I'd promised. First to County Public Works about the untreated slick at the boat ramp. They logged it and salted by afternoon. Second to Regional Fish and Wildlife about monofilament tangles near the reeds. The woman on the line thanked me, asked for location pins, and said a volunteer crew would clean line and hooks once access improved. Happens more than folks realize, she said. Good catch. I never mentioned why I noticed it. I didn't need to. That Saturday at the garage, Calvin spotted the first heartstone beside my timing light and gave me a sideways grin. New paperweight? Something like that. He picked it up, turned it over and set it back carefully. Looks like luck? Maybe, I said. He waited like he wanted the rest of the story, then just nodded and went back to a brake job. He never asked again. Around here, that counts as respect. My apprentice asked about the old dog sleeping by the parts heater. I told him he'd joined the crew and answered to Cap after the thermos piece that came home. Cap accepted the title with no objections and an immediate claim on the warmest floor spot in the building. On my first dialysis day, Lena drove. I hated that, and I let her do it anyway. The room smelled like sanitizer and warmed blankets, all soft beeps and low television noise. Needles were not as abstract when they were mine. I watched fluid move through clear tubing and felt stripped down to dependence in a way I had avoided my whole life. Lena sat beside me and read from her phone, then from a paperback, then from nothing at all when I needed quiet. At one point, she reached over and tapped my forearm. "Still here?" she asked. "Still here," I said. It became our phrase. On hard days, one of us texted it, and the other answered. 2 Sundays later, we took Noah to the bench just after lunch. The lake had gone from iron grey to winter blue, and sunlight moved across the water in bright, broken panels. Noah carried a peanut butter sandwich, told me every fact he knew about loons, and asked why Cap followed him like a fuzzy deputy. Lena brought a thermos and poured 3 small cups of cocoa, one mostly marshmallow by legal requirement. We sat with Marcy's plaque between us and talked about regular things: school pickup, rota prices, Noah's science project, my treatment fatigue, her overtime schedule, nothing mystical, everything important. When Noah wandered a few yards down the path collecting flat pebbles, Lena leaned closer and said, "I don't need anyone else to believe me. Me either. You ever think we should go looking?" I watched the cedar line, still and sunlit. "No, I think we were found when we needed finding." She nodded, eyes wet but calm. "That sounds right." By the first week of March, the freeze was a memory on the weather page instead of a weight on my chest. Not gone, just past. The road stayed open. My treatment rhythm got less chaotic. I cut 1 shift a week and stopped pretending exhaustion was a character flaw. Lena kept me honest with calendar invites and blunt reminders. I kept showing up. That was the repair. I accounted for every piece we'd carried through that winter. The first Heartstone stayed on my workbench at the garage, left of the vise where my hand touched it before difficult jobs. The striped stone sat on Marcy's memorial bench, returned on a quiet morning with Lena present, because that one felt like it belonged to the place it came from. The darker stone rested on my kitchen windowsill, beside a photo of Marcy laughing over a camp stove. The final stone from the sleep night lived in Lena's living room, on a shelf above Noah's art, where he called it Grandpa's Brave Rock. The cracked thermos cap moved from the junk drawer to my key rack by the door. The coiled fishing line got handed to the volunteer cleanup crew when they came through, and they filled 2 buckets from that shoreline alone. I never saw him in full again. A few dawns brought that same deep quiet over the reeds, and once Cap lifted his head toward the cedars and wagged before settling back down. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it didn't. The strange details I had flagged in fear became details I held in gratitude. The windless hush, the loon that waited to call, the earthy scent before a kind act, the scale of prints beside my boot, the way gentleness can come from a place larger than your understanding and still ask nothing from you except honesty. I used to believe the world was a machine, predictable if you had the manual, hostile if you didn't. Now I lived inside a wider framework. Medicine kept my body going. Schedules, labs, and access checks mattered. I respected every one of them. But another truth ran alongside that one, equally real to me. Being witnessed with patience can heal damage no chart can grade. At the bench, at the clinic, at my own kitchen table, I learned that help is not the same as weakness, and mystery is not the same as threat. Most evenings I locked the garage, patted the stone on my bench, and headed home to texts from Lena about Noah's homework, or a reminder to drink water I didn't want. Cap snored by the heater. The lake waited on weekends. My life stayed hard in places, but it stopped being lonely in the way that had nearly finished me. That was what I carried now. 4 stones, 1 old Cap, a daughter who answered when I called and called when I went quiet, and the settled knowledge that the world remained mysterious, yes, but no longer hostile.